In the NFL, there are moments of greatness, teams that rise above the competition and cement their place in football history. But for every legendary franchise, there are those that sink to the depths of despair, where nothing seems to go right, and losing becomes the norm. These are the teams that, through a combination of poor management, disastrous performances, and just plain bad luck, have etched their names in the NFL's Hall of Shame. While championships are celebrated, these seasons are remembered for all the wrong reasons. Across the decades, a handful of teams have set a new standard for futility, embodying what it means to hit rock bottom in professional football. From winless seasons to humiliating blowouts, these squads faced failure on a historic level. Whether it was defensive collapses, offensive ineptitude, or simply a lack of leadership, these teams became infamous for their ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of, well, more defeat. Let's dive into the darkest chapters in NFL history, where hope seemed out of reach, and the road to victory was a distant dream. In 2009, the St. Louis Rams found themselves at the bottom of the NFL, enduring a season that many fans would like to forget. With a record of 1-15, this team struggled in every aspect of the game. The offense was stagnant, the defense was porous, and hope was in short supply. Their lone victory came in Week 8 against the Detroit Lions, a team that was equally inept at the time. Aside from that single bright spot, the Rams' season was defined by blowout losses and an inability to compete at the most basic level. The Rams' offense, in particular, was painful to watch. Over the course of 16 games, they managed to score just 175 points, an average of less than 11 points per game. For a professional football team, that kind of offensive production is unacceptable. Quarterback play was erratic, with Mark Bulger and Kyle Boller both failing to establish any sort of consistency. The passing game lacked rhythm, and the team only managed to throw 10 touchdown passes the entire season, one of the worst outputs in NFL history. Defensively, the Rams were just as bad. They gave up 436 points over the course of the season, an average of 27.3 points per game. Opposing offenses had little trouble moving the ball against them, and the Rams failed to generate turnovers or pressure on the quarterback. In 5 games, they were beaten by 3 or more touchdowns, including a humiliating 42-6 loss to the Indianapolis Colts and a 35-0 shutout against the San Francisco 49ers. Week after week, the defense looked overwhelmed and outmatched. One of the biggest issues for the Rams that year was their complete lack of playmakers. Star running back Steven Jackson was the lone bright spot on offense, rushing for over 1,400 yards despite playing behind a weak offensive line. But even Jackson couldn't carry the team on his own. The receiving corps was underwhelming, with no player stepping up as a reliable target. Without weapons in the passing game, opposing defenses stacked the box against Jackson, daring the Rams to throw the ball, and they simply couldn't. The coaching staff, led by head coach Steve Spagnuolo, struggled to find solutions. Spagnuolo, a defensive-minded coach known for his success with the New York Giants, couldn't replicate that magic in St. Louis. His schemes failed to inspire, and the team often looked lost on both sides of the ball. As the losses piled up, it became clear that the Rams were heading for one of the worst seasons in franchise history. The atmosphere in the locker room turned sour, and the fan base grew increasingly frustrated with the direction of the team. What made this season even more painful for Rams fans was that it came during a time when the franchise was already in turmoil. There were rumors swirling about the team's potential move to Los Angeles, and the front office was in disarray. The lack of stability at the top filtered down to the field, where the Rams struggled to find any sense of identity. With management in flux and a roster devoid of talent, it was a perfect storm for a historically bad season. Despite the nightmare of 2009, the Rams would eventually rebound in the years to come, but this season stood as a stark reminder of how far they had fallen. The team would go through a rebuild that eventually led to success in the years following their move to Los Angeles, but for fans in St. Louis, this was a painful chapter that they'd rather leave in the past. It wasn't just about losing, it was about losing in a way that left little room for hope. For the Rams, 2009 wasn't just a bad season, it was the epitome of hopelessness. A team that had once been competitive had sunk to the lowest depths of the NFL, with no clear path forward. In a league built on parity, the Rams were anything but equal, and their struggles that year will forever be etched in the minds of their fans. The Cleveland Browns in 2017 achieved the unfortunate feat of becoming only the second team in NFL history to go winless through a 16-game season. With a record of 0-16, this team epitomized dysfunction, poor management, and sheer hopelessness. From quarterback struggles to a defense that couldn't stop anyone, the Browns were the definition of a disaster on the field. Scoring only 234 points while allowing 410, they ended the season with a point differential of -176, underscoring just how outmatched they were. One of the most glaring problems for the 2017 Browns was the quarterback position. The team cycled through multiple quarterbacks, but none were able to provide any consistency or spark. DeShone Kizer, the rookie quarterback who played most of the season, threw for 11 touchdowns but was intercepted 22 times. His inexperience showed in critical moments, as the Browns failed to convert drives into points and consistently turned the ball over in key situations. The quarterback carousel was one of the clearest symbols of Cleveland's chaotic season. Defensively, the Browns weren't any better. They allowed over 30 points in 6 different games, often getting blown out in matchups they were expected to lose. Opponents found little resistance, as Cleveland's defense struggled to generate pressure on the quarterback and often left wide receivers open in the secondary. This lack of execution was glaring throughout the season, and even when the offense managed to put points on the board, the defense was too porous to hold leads or keep games competitive. The Browns roster was filled with young, inexperienced players, and the coaching staff, led by Hugh Jackson, failed to develop them into a cohesive unit. Jackson's leadership was heavily criticized, as he won only 1 game in 2 seasons as head coach, leading to widespread calls for his dismissal. Despite the Browns' historic level of failure, Jackson remained at the helm for the next season, a decision that left many fans questioning the direction of the team. This loyalty to a coach with such a poor track record baffled analysts and further highlighted the dysfunction within the organization. One of the low points of the season came in Week 12, when the Browns were humiliated in a 27-10 loss against the Cincinnati Bengals. Kizer threw an interception and was sacked 5 times, while the defense allowed the Bengals to rack up 371 total yards. This game encapsulated the Browns' season: poor quarterback play, an ineffective defense, and a coaching staff unable to make adjustments. By this point, it was clear that Cleveland was headed for an infamous 0-16 finish. Adding insult to injury, the Browns lost several games that were within reach. 3 of their losses were by 3 points or less, and a Week 14 overtime defeat to the Green Bay Packers saw them blow a 2-touchdown lead in the 4th quarter. These near wins teased fans with hope, only for the team to collapse when it mattered most. It became clear that the Browns' culture of losing wasn't just a product of bad luck, it was systemic, and it plagued every aspect of the franchise. The 2017 season also marked a low point for the Browns' front office. The failure to draft and develop a reliable quarterback, combined with questionable free agency decisions, left the roster depleted of talent. Despite having high draft picks, the Browns consistently missed on their selections, leading to a lack of playmakers on both sides of the ball. This inefficiency in building a roster contributed to the team's continued struggles and reinforced their identity as one of the worst teams in the NFL. For Browns fans, 2017 was a season that epitomized hopelessness. The franchise, already burdened by years of failure, had now become one of only 2 teams to endure a winless 16-game season. While Cleveland would eventually begin to rebuild, this season remains a painful reminder of the depths to which the team had sunk. 2017 wasn't just a bad year, it was historically awful, and it left scars that the fan base won't soon forget. The Indianapolis Colts in 1991 had one of the most anemic offenses the NFL had ever seen. With a record of 1-15, this team struggled to do anything right on the offensive side of the ball, managing to score only 143 points across 16 games, an average of just under 9 points per game. It was the lowest scoring offense in the league that year, and for good reason. The Colts' quarterback play was disastrous, their running game non-existent, and their wide receivers largely invisible. Their inability to move the ball was painfully obvious every Sunday. In fact, the Colts managed to score fewer than 10 points in half of their games, leaving fans frustrated and wondering when things would ever improve. In a league where points are king, the Colts simply couldn't find the end zone. Their offensive woes reached their peak in Week 11 when they were shut out by the New England Patriots, losing 38-0. This game highlighted just how outmatched Indianapolis was, and with every failed drive, it became clear this team was headed for a historically bad season. Defensively, the Colts weren't much better. They allowed 380 points throughout the year, and their defense was particularly vulnerable to big plays. In 5 games, they lost by 3 or more touchdowns, including a brutal 41-0 loss to the New York Jets. Week after week, the Colts' defense failed to generate pressure or force turnovers, leaving their offense with no room for error. Unfortunately, the offense couldn't capitalize, and the defense couldn't stop anyone. It was a perfect storm of failure on both sides of the ball. Adding to the misery, the Colts' lack of talent was evident across the roster. Their quarterback situation was dire, with Jeff George, the first overall pick in the 1990 draft, struggling to live up to expectations. George threw only 10 touchdowns all season while tossing 16 interceptions, a stat line that did nothing to inspire confidence. The running game wasn't much better, with no player rushing for more than 600 yards on the year. When you consider these performances, it's no surprise that Indianapolis couldn't win more than a single game. Despite the talent gap, Colts fans remained loyal, even during one of the darkest seasons in franchise history. And speaking of loyalty, if you're enjoying this deep dive into NFL history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more breakdowns of football's biggest moments, both legendary and disastrous. Your support helps us bring you more stories from the world of sports, and trust me, we've got plenty more to share. The frustration wasn't limited to the field. The Colts front office faced heavy criticism for their inability to build a competitive roster. Poor draft decisions and lackluster free agent signings left the team without the playmakers needed to compete. Fans grew restless as the season dragged on, with each loss amplifying the pressure on the team's leadership to make drastic changes. It was clear that Indianapolis was in desperate need of a rebuild, but in 1991, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Perhaps the most embarrassing part of the season came in Week 9 when the Colts were once again shut out, this time losing 38-0 to the Patriots. That game epitomized the Colts' season: a lifeless offense, a defense that couldn't keep up, and a coaching staff that had run out of answers. Indianapolis finished the year with a -187-point differential, highlighting just how thoroughly they were dominated by their opponents. Looking back, the 1991 Colts are often remembered as one of the most hopeless teams in NFL history. Their lack of offensive firepower, combined with a porous defense, made for a historically bad season that left fans and analysts alike questioning the direction of the franchise. It wasn't just a season of failure, it was a season that forced the Colts to reconsider everything, from their roster to their leadership, in order to begin the long road to recovery. If you've started following the NFL after the year 2000, chances are you associate certain teams with dominance and success. You've seen franchises reach the pinnacle of football glory, building legacies that seem untouchable. But what if I told you that one of the greatest dynasties in NFL history was once so hopeless, so utterly lost, that it barely resembles the powerhouse we know today? A team that, before it reached the top, went through one of the most humiliating seasons in NFL history? Brace yourself, because this might come as a shock. In fourth place, we have the 1990 New England Patriots, a team far removed from the championship glory they would one day achieve. That year, the Patriots limped to a record of 1-15, enduring one of the darkest chapters in their franchise's history. For fans of the Brady-Belichick era, it's almost unimaginable, but long before they were lifting Lombardi trophies, New England was a disaster on the field. With an offense that could barely score and a defense that couldn't stop anyone, the Patriots were the definition of a hopeless team. The Patriots' offense managed to score only 181 points across 16 games, an average of just 11.3 points per game. Quarterback Steve Grogan and a rotation of backups failed to generate any consistent offense, throwing just 14 touchdown passes all season. The running game was equally ineffective, and the team struggled to move the ball, let alone score. With this level of offensive ineptitude, it's no surprise that New England didn't stand a chance in most of their matchups. Defensively, the Patriots were a mess. They allowed a staggering 446 points, and 6 of their losses came by 3 or more touchdowns. One of the low points came in a 37-0 defeat against the Buffalo Bills, a game in which the Patriots were completely outclassed from start to finish. The defense couldn't stop the run, couldn't defend the pass, and most of the time, they couldn't even slow their opponents down. It was a team that looked overmatched every single week. What made this season even more embarrassing were the off-field issues that plagued the organization. Ownership struggles and player scandals cast a dark cloud over the team, and there was a general sense of dysfunction from top to bottom. Head coach Rod Rust couldn't find any answers on the field, and his leadership was called into question as the losses piled up. By the end of the season, it was clear that the franchise needed a complete overhaul, something no one could have predicted would lead to the dynasty that was to come. For fans of New England, the 1990 season was a year of despair. The Patriots finished with a point differential of -265, one of the worst in the league that year. They scored fewer than 20 points in every single game, and their defense allowed an average of 27.9 points per game. It wasn't just that they were losing, they were being humiliated on a weekly basis, and the once promising franchise had become the laughingstock of the league. If you've made it this far, and you're enjoying these deep dives into NFL history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more breakdowns of football's greatest highs and lows. Your support helps us bring you these stories, and trust me, there's plenty more drama in the world of football history. For the Patriots, 1990 was the rock bottom they had to hit before eventually rising to greatness. Little did anyone know that within a decade, this same team would begin one of the most dominant eras in NFL history. But before the triumphs came the tears, and the Patriots of 1990 will always be remembered as a team that had no direction, no hope, and no future, at least, not that anyone could see at the time. When fans think of the Baltimore Colts, they often remember the glory days of Johnny Unitas and championships. But in 1981, those memories were long gone, replaced by a season that would go down as one of the worst defensive collapses in NFL history. If you think teams today struggle on defense, you haven't seen what the Colts went through. This was a team that allowed points at a historic rate, making their season a nightmare for fans and coaches alike. It's almost hard to believe, but yes, this once proud franchise endured one of the most humiliating defensive seasons ever recorded. With a record of 2-14, the 1981 Colts were a team in complete disarray. They allowed a jaw-dropping 533 points, the most any team had ever given up at that time, averaging 33.3 points allowed per game. Opposing offenses tore through them like tissue paper, and it seemed like no lead was safe. The defense was so porous that in 5 games, they allowed over 40 points, including a 52-14 blowout against the Cincinnati Bengals and a 57-21 thrashing by the New England Patriots. Week after week, the Colts couldn't stop the bleeding. What made this season particularly painful for fans was the sheer hopelessness of watching the team's defense collapse on such a grand scale. No matter what changes the coaching staff tried to make, nothing worked. The defensive line couldn't generate pressure, the secondary was consistently out of position, and the linebackers struggled to cover or stop the run. As a result, the Colts were out of almost every game by halftime, and the scoreboard often resembled that of a college game rather than a professional football contest. Offensively, the Colts weren't much better. They managed to score 259 points over the course of the season, which wasn't terrible by the standards of the day, but it was never enough to keep up with the points their defense was giving up. Quarterback Burt Jones and his backup Greg Landry couldn't generate the kind of offensive firepower needed to stay competitive. Even when the offense managed to put points on the board, the defense quickly gave them back. It was a vicious cycle of failure that defined the entire season. The collapse of the 1981 Colts wasn't just a product of poor play, it was also the result of a front office that failed to build a competitive roster. The team was in desperate need of talent, but poor draft decisions and questionable personnel moves left them thin at key positions. By the time the season rolled around, it was clear that this team simply wasn't built to compete, and the results on the field reflected that harsh reality. For fans in Baltimore, this season was a stark reminder that their beloved Colts were far from the championship contenders they once were. As the season dragged on, it became clear that changes were needed at every level of the organization. Head coach Mike McCormack was overwhelmed, unable to find any solutions for a team that was spiraling out of control. The frustration among players and fans was palpable, and by the end of the season, it was obvious that the Colts needed a complete overhaul. Little did fans know, however, that this would be one of the last seasons they'd ever see their team play in Baltimore. Just a few years later, the Colts would pack up and move to Indianapolis, leaving behind a city and a legacy in turmoil. The 1981 season stands out not just because of the losses, but because of how spectacularly the Colts failed. This was a team that couldn't get anything right on defense, and even when they had moments of hope on offense, they were quickly erased by an opponent's next drive. For a once proud franchise, this was rock bottom. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into NFL disasters, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss another story from football's most shocking moments. For the Colts, the aftermath of 1981 marked the beginning of the end in Baltimore. The team would continue to struggle for a few more seasons before ultimately leaving the city in the dead of night. But for those who remember that year, the legacy of the 1981 Colts is one of complete and total defensive failure, a season that will forever be remembered for all the wrong reasons. For years, the Detroit Lions had been a franchise synonymous with mediocrity, but in 2008, they achieved a new level of infamy. This was the year that Detroit became the first team in NFL history to lose all 16 regular season games, a feat that cemented their place in the record books for all the wrong reasons. While most teams experience ups and downs, the Lions' 2008 season was a steady and relentless descent into failure, filled with blowout losses, quarterback woes, and a defense that couldn't stop a high school team. The Lions weren't just bad, they were historically awful. With a record of 0-16, the Lions became a team no one wanted to face, not because they were tough, but because they were so easy to beat. They were outscored by nearly 250 points over the course of the season, scoring 268 while allowing a staggering 517. 7 of their losses came by 3 or more touchdowns, and their defense allowed an average of 32.4 points per game. It wasn't just that they were losing, it was the way they were losing that made this team one of the most hopeless in NFL history. The quarterback situation in 2008 was a nightmare for Detroit. Over the course of the season, the Lions used 7 different quarterbacks, none of whom could find any consistency or rhythm. Jon Kitna started the season but was quickly sidelined with an injury, leaving Dan Orlovsky and Drew Stanton to pick up the pieces. Orlovsky's infamous play, where he ran out of the back of the end zone for a safety in a game against the Minnesota Vikings, became the symbol of the Lions' incompetence that year. It was a season full of turnovers, missed opportunities, and a revolving door at the most important position in football. Defensively, the Lions were just as bad, if not worse. They allowed over 500 points, and opposing teams seemed to score at will. Whether it was on the ground or through the air, Detroit's defense had no answers. Their inability to stop even the most basic offensive schemes turned every Sunday into a nightmare. In their most humiliating defeat, a 47-10 loss to the Tennessee Titans on Thanksgiving Day, the Lions were completely outclassed on national television, cementing their place as the league's laughingstock. Off the field, the front office wasn't faring much better. General Manager Matt Millen had been under fire for years due to poor draft decisions and failed free agent signings. By the time the 2008 season rolled around, the roster was a mess, with no clear direction or long-term strategy. Millen was fired early in the season, but by then, the damage was already done. The Lions' lack of talent, particularly at key positions like quarterback and the offensive line, made it impossible for the team to compete. It was a situation that had been building for years, and 2008 was the year it all came crashing down. For fans, the 2008 season was the culmination of years of frustration and disappointment. Detroit had long been a team on the fringes of relevance, but this season took things to a new low. Each week, fans hoped for a turnaround, only to be met with more incompetence and ineptitude on the field. And speaking of hope, if you're enjoying this breakdown of NFL's most hopeless teams, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more stories from the league's darkest moments. Trust me, there's plenty more where this came from. The Lions' winless season was more than just a statistical failure, it was a complete collapse of a franchise that had already been teetering on the edge. While the team would eventually bounce back in the years to come, the scars of 2008 remain. For the players, the coaches, and most of all, the fans, it was a season they would never forget, and not for any of the right reasons. To this day, the 2008 Detroit Lions stand as a reminder of just how bad things can get in the NFL. When you think of the worst teams in NFL history, no list is complete without the 1976 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In their inaugural season, the Buccaneers managed to achieve a level of futility that remains unmatched. With a record of 0-14, they became the first team in NFL history to complete a season without a single win. While expansion teams often struggle in their first few seasons, the Bucs took things to a new level, setting records for offensive ineptitude and defensive collapse that still resonate to this day. They weren't just bad, they were historically hopeless. The Bucs' offensive performance in 1976 was, quite simply, a disaster. Over the course of the season, they scored a mere 125 points, an average of just under 9 points per game. They were shut out in 5 games, unable to put any points on the board in more than a third of their matchups. Quarterback Steve Spurrier, who would later go on to become a legendary college football coach, struggled mightily, throwing only 7 touchdown passes all season. The team's offensive line couldn't protect him, and their running game was virtually non-existent. It was a season in which nothing worked on offense. On the defensive side of the ball, things weren't much better. The Bucs allowed 412 points, an average of nearly 30 points per game. 5 of their losses came by 4 or more touchdowns, and opposing teams scored at will against Tampa Bay. The defense was overmatched at every level, failing to generate pressure on the quarterback or cover receivers. Week after week, the Bucs were blown out, and it became clear that this was a team that didn't belong on the same field as their opponents. One of the most infamous stretches of the Bucs season came in their final 5 games, where they were outscored 173-29. Their worst defeat came at the hands of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who crushed them 42-0. By the end of the season, the Bucs had set the standard for futility, losing all 14 games and becoming the first team in modern NFL history to finish a season without a win. It was a humbling experience for both the players and the coaching staff, led by John McKay, who famously quipped when asked about his team's execution, "I'm in favor of it." What made the 1976 Buccaneers even more remarkable was the fact that they didn't just lose games, they lost in ways that seemed almost unimaginable. From botched plays to missed assignments, the team found new and inventive ways to fail every week. Their struggles weren't limited to the scoreboard, they extended to every facet of the game, from the coaching staff down to the players. It was a season where hope was in short supply, and fans who had been excited about the team's debut were left shaking their heads. Adding to their misery was the fact that the Bucs didn't just lose, they kept losing. The team would go on to lose the first 26 games in franchise history, a record that still stands today. The streak extended into the following season, making Tampa Bay synonymous with failure. The expansion struggles were more than just a tough start, they became part of the team's identity for years to come, and it would be a long road before the Bucs became competitive in the NFL. Despite the horror show on the field, the Bucs would eventually find success, but it would take time. The 1976 season was just the beginning of what would become a long road to relevance for the franchise. For Tampa Bay fans, this was a season to forget, if only they could. And speaking of unforgettable moments, if you've been enjoying this dive into the NFL's darkest chapters, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more stories to uncover, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. The 1976 Buccaneers weren't just bad, they set a benchmark for how low a team can go in the NFL. While they would go on to lose the first 26 games in franchise history, that initial season stands as the most hopeless. They were an expansion team that simply wasn't ready to compete, and their failure on both sides of the ball made them a punchline in NFL circles. But despite the jokes and the humiliation, the Bucs story serves as a reminder that even the worst teams can eventually find their way to success. It just takes time, a lot of time. The NFL has seen its fair share of champions, but it's the hopeless seasons that remind us just how hard it is to compete at the highest level. These 7 teams, through a combination of bad luck, poor management, and disastrous performances, reached the lowest depths the league has ever seen. Their failures have become part of NFL lore, a reminder that even in a sport built on competition, some teams just can't seem to find their footing. What did you think of the list? Do you agree with these picks, or do you have another team in mind that deserves a spot? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the NFL's greatest stories, both the triumphs and the heartbreaks. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.